Hello and welcome. My name's Alan, and today we are back with more of the massacre at El Mozote. So yeah, we'll be picking up here with chapter 2, which is called Surviving in the Red Zone. Alright. In the weeks that followed the discovery of the skulls of the children, as each day's work at El Mozote yielded up a fresh harvest, the initial numbers came to seem small. But in San Salvador, 5 hours by road to the west, where President Alfredo Cristiani and the generals of the guerrillas turned politicians were struggling with one another about how to put in place or not put in place a purge of the officer corps, which was proving to be the most difficult provision of the 10-month-old peace accord, struggling, that is, over what kind of reconciliation would come to pass in El Salvador after more than a decade of savage war. The first skulls of the children were enough to provoke a poisonous controversy. Those 23 skulls and the nearly 100 more that were uncovered in the succeeding days were accommodated by the nascent Salvadoran body politic in two ways. Members of human rights groups, those members, that is, that had survived the war, along with the politicians of the left, many of whom had been guerrillas shortly before, hailed the discovery as as definitive evidence that a matanza, a great killing, had taken place in Morazan, and that they had been saying for 11 hours or for 11 years had at least been proved true, uh, that have been proved true. Members of the government, on the other hand, and various military officers found themselves forced to concede that something had indeed happened in Morazan, and they insisted that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Dr. Juan Mateo um, Mateo York, the director of El Salvador's Institute of Forensic Medicine, declared that the skulls themselves proved nothing, for there was an abundance of armed children in the guerrillas. El Diario de Hoy, an influential right-wing daily, published a reconstruction according to which the guerrillas had barricaded themselves in what seemed to have been a religious center, and from there opened fire on the troops, making the deaths of the children, women, and old people possible. President Cristiani's government, already under attack for stalling in the dismissal of senior officers, maintained its position that no records existed of an army operation in Morazan in early December of 1981. And yet, on the ninth day of that month, any reader of La Prensa Gráfica, one of San Salvador's major dailies, could have learned that all of the highways with access to Gotera and other towns in the department of Morazan are under strict military control. No vehicles or individuals are permitted to enter the zones of conflict in order to avoid accidents and misunderstandings. Neither was the entry of journalists or individuals permitted. The Department of Morazan had been scaled off from the rest of the country. 4,000 men, drawn from the security forces, the National Guard, and the Treasury Police, and from regular units of the Salvadoran Army, were hard at work. The area north of Torola River, the heart of the red zone, was alive with the thud of mortars, the clatter of small arms fire, and the intermittent roar of helicopters. 2 days before, Operación Rescate, Operation Rescue, had begun. Many of the towns and villages were already empty during and after army operations of the previous spring and fall. Thousands of peasants had left their homes and begun a long trek over the mountains of the Honduran border and the refugee camps beyond. Of those who of those who remained, many made it a practice and the first sign of any army approach to leave their villages and hide in the caves and ravines and gullies that honeycomb the mountainous region. But El Mozote was crowded. In the days before Operation Rescue, people from the outlying areas had flooded into the hamlet. Many people were passing by the house saying, "Come on, let's go to El Mozote." An old peasant named Sebastiano Luna told me as he stood behind the yellow tape, watching the experts bent low over the brown earth and of the sacristy of Santa Catarina. Between their feet lay an expanse of dark rubble, a miniature landscape of hills and ridges and valleys in every shade of brown. It took a moment or two to distinguish among the dirty brown hillocks and skulls the parts of skulls which marked with a bit of red tape and a number, and beneath the skulls a skull fragments and the earthen rubble, scores of small brown bundles, heaped one on top the other, twisted together, the material so impregnated with blood and soil that it could no longer be recognized as clothing. Amid the rubble in the northeast corner of the tiny room that had been called El Convento, though it was really a kind of combined sacristy and parish house, in which the itinerant priest, when he visited the hamlet, could vest himself and sometimes, perhaps, stay the night. A dark-haired young woman in denim overalls was kneeling. Leaning forward, she placed a tape measure against the rubble and called out coordinates in the softly accented Spanish of Argentina, while a few feet away, another young woman placed a ruler against her notebook and described a red dot, locating number 59 among the other dots that by now clustered and ran together on the page. Now the woman in overalls bent down and gently drew toward her a small bundle, slowly smoothing out the creases and folds, disentangling and unwrapping, exposing at last, what appeared to be a cluster of tiny brown twigs. Finally, she began with almost agonizing gentleness, extracting the brown bits and placing them on a sheet of cardboard. "Left tibia, fragments only," she sang out in a low monotone. "Vertebrae, 1, 2, 3, 6 of them. Tibia left, I think. Metacarpals." Nearby, sitting on the stone foundation, a man in a billed cap wrote rapidly on a clipboard. After some minutes, number 59 began to take shape on the bit of cardboard, incomplete but recognizable a tiny skeleton, perhaps a foot and a half long. Now she began to disentangle the bits of ruined fabric. Shirt, light in color, fragmented with buttons, belt of brown leather, metal buckle, pants light in color with patches of blue and green color in the posterior part. In the pants pocket, um, mm, the strong voice took an odd slide downward and stopped. Over her shoulder, I saw her staring at something in her palm and then heard her swear in a low voice, Hijo de puta! She turned and opened her hand to reveal a tiny figure, a little horse of bright orange plastic. Number 59 had been a lucky child, had had a family prosperous enough to provide a lucky toy. After a moment, the anthropologist Mercedes Doretti said, ordinarily we could use this for identification. I mean, even after 11 years, any mother would recognize this as her kid, you know? She looked back at number 59 and then at the brown rubble. But here they killed all the mothers too. Behind the yellow tape, Sebastiano Luna and his wife, Alba Ignacia del Cid, stood silent amid a knot of peasants, watching. They had walked from their small house several miles outside El Mozote, where the dirt track joins the Black Road. 11 years before, in early December 1981, scores of people were passing by their house, pulling their children along by the hand, laboring under the weight of their belongings. Come with us, they had called out to the old couple. Come with us to El Mozote. The afternoon before, the people of El Mozote had gathered some 50 yards from the church in front of the general store of Marcos Diaz. Today, that building is easy to identify, for one can still make out the dusty adobe ruin, the division between the living quarters and the shop, though it is harder to appreciate now that the house had been the hamlet's grandest, that Diaz had been the richest man in town. Marcos Diaz had summoned the townspeople, neighbors, and customers all, and when they had assembled, perhaps a couple of hundred campesinos milling about in the dusty street, the men in caps and straw hats, and the women in bright colored skirts, holding children in their arms. He addressed them from the doorway. He had just come up the mountain from his regular buying trip to San Miguel, Marcos Diaz said, and as he was waiting at the checkpoint in Gotera, at the entrance to the red zone, an officer in the town had greeted him. Marcos Diaz, an important man, had friends among the officers, and then pulled him aside for a little talk. Diaz would do well to stock up, the officer said, for soon the army would launch a large operation in Morazan, and nothing and no one would be permitted to enter or leave the zone. But his friend Diaz needn't worry, the officer assured him. The people of El Mozote would have no problems, provided they stayed where they were. In the street that day, these words of Marco Diaz's set off a debate. Some townspeople wanted to head for the mountains immediately, for the war had lately been coming closer to the hamlet. Only the week before, a plane had dropped 2 bombs near El Mozote, damaging its one-room school, and though no one had been hurt, the people had been terrified. A lot of the people wanted to leave. There was a lot of fear. Rufina Amaya told me when I visited her in November 1992, and a few people did leave. My godfather left with his family. My children were crying. They said, "Mama, let's go." But Marcos Diaz, a man of influence, had put his prestige on the line, and he insisted that his neighbors would be safe only if they stayed in their homes. That if they left the hamlet, they and their families risked being caught up in the operation. The officer had been quite explicit. That was the lie, Rafina Amaya told me. That was the betrayal. Otherwise, people would have left. In the end, Marcos Diaz's prestige decided the issue. Though the debate went on that afternoon and into the following morning, most of the people of El Mozote finally accepted his assurances. They had been soldiers before, after all. Soldiers often passed through on patrol and sometimes bought supplies in El Mozote. Only the month before, soldiers had come during an operation and occupied El Chingo and La Cruz, two hills overlooking the town, and though the people of El Mozote could hear mortars and scattered shooting in the distance, the soldiers had not bothered them. In the crazy quilt map of northern Morazan in 1981, where villages belonged to the government or to the guerrillas or to neither or both, where the officers saw the towns and hamlets in varying shades of pink and red, El Mozote had not been known as a guerrilla town. The army spent a lot of the time around here, Rafina told me. We all sold them food. If the soldiers were looking to find guerrillas, that was fine with us because we didn't have anything to do with them. And the guerrillas knew about our relations with the army. The guerrillas knew. The soldiers knew. Northern Morazan during the early 80s was a very small world in which identity for the perception of identity often meant the difference between living and dying. That El Mozote in late 1981 was not a guerrilla town is a fact central to Rafina's story and lies at the heart of the mystery of what happened there. And though it is a fact, one of that almost everyone from the zone affirms, it seems to have nonetheless been a slightly more complicated fact than Rafina makes out. As in many other communities in northern Morazan, the people of El Mozote were struggling to keep their balance in the middle of the perilously shifting ground of a brutal war. Were working hard to remain on friendly terms with the soldiers while fearing to alienate the guerrillas. Joaquin Villalobos, who was the leading commandante of the People's Revolutionary Army, or ERP, the dominant guerrilla group in Morazan, told me flatly during an interview in his headquarters in San Salvador that the people of El Mozote would not support us, only to concede 20 minutes later that his fighters had, at least on some occasions, bought supplies in the hamlet. They had the lowest level of relationship with us, only the very slightest commercial one. Villalobos said. Licho, a rebel commander who had grown up in Hocoitique, a few miles from El Mozote, acknowledged to me during an interview in Perquin that in the late 70s, some from El Mozote had been our supporters, but that long before 1981, these supporters had come along with us. They were they had come along with us. They were with us, he added quickly. The people who were still in El Mozote were afraid of us. But the reason apparently was that only their fear and frank terror that many villagers in the zone felt about exposing themselves to army retribution, but their ideology. The guerrillas' support in Morazan had grown largely in soil made fertile by the work of the liberation theology, by the teachings of left-leaning Catholic parents. But El Mozote had been uniquely unreceptive to the blandishments, to such blandishments, for the hamlet was known throughout the zone as a stronghold of the Protestant evangelical movement. People had begun to convert as early as the mid 60s, and by 1980, it is likely that half or more of the people in El Mozote considered themselves born again Christians. The evangelicals had their own chapel and their own pastor, and they were known as were born again Christians throughout Central America for their anti communism. Everyone knew there were many evangelicals in El Mozote, and these people wouldn't support us, Licho told me. Sometimes they told us things, yes, but they didn't want anything to do with us. So unlike many other hamlets of Morazon, El Mozote was a place where the guerrillas had learned not to look for recruits. Instead, a delicate coexistence had been forged, an unstated agreement by both parties to look the other way. The guerrillas passed by El Mozote only at night, and when they did, Rufina says, the people would hear the dogs barking and they'd be afraid. She remembers seeing guerrillas only once in daylight, a few ragged young people, unarmed and wearing civilian clothes, had come into the hamlet and tried to hold a meeting in the tiny church of Santa Catarina. Rufina didn't attend, nor did most of the other townspeople. I remember people saying, don't get involved. Let's just live and work and not get involved. People just didn't want anything to do with it. I had 4 children to look after. You're worrying about feeding your family and try not to pay attention to these other things. And so when Marcos Diaz brought his news from Gotera, when he conveyed the strong words of the officer and presented the choice as one of leaving the town and risking getting involved in the operation or of staying put and remaining safe, there was never much doubt about what the people of El Mozote would in the end decide. That very afternoon, at Marcos Diaz's urging, people began fanning out from the hamlet into the outlying districts to spread the word that one and all should come to El Mozote and quickly, for only there would be they would be protected. Marcos Diaz helped matters along by letting it be known that he would offer on credit as much food and other supplies as the newcomers needed. He told them to spread the word that we would all eat here, Rufina says, that we would all be safe. Peasants poured into the hamlet, occupying every bit of space. All the rooms in Marcos Diaz's house were filled with people. Every house had people staying there from outside. Even the plaza in front of the church was crowded with people, for the few houses could not accommodate them all. Come to El Mozote. That's what everyone was saying. The old peasant Sebastiano Luna told me. He and Abba Ignacia del Cid had stood in front of their house, had watched the people pass, but they had decided not to go. I had half an idea something bad might happen, Sebastiano said. So I told her, nodding to his wife, you go if you want to. I'm staying. And I, said Alba. I said, no, no, I won't go without you because they'll ask me where my husband is. They'll say he's not here because he's a gorilla, and then they'll kill me. Either we both go or we both stay. So Sebastiano and Alba hid in the mountains above their house. They saw soldiers pass by and saw a helicopter hover and descend, and later they saw thick columns of smoke rising from El Mozote and smelled the odor of what seemed like tons of roasting meat. So, yeah, that's the end of chapter 2. It's it is disturbing to know these people were more allied. They tried not to take part in it, but they had better relations with the army and the side that ended up slaughtering them, massacring them, than they did the guerrillas. So many children. Early in that chapter, we read about how the journalists thought, oh, it looks like twigs or something. No, it's pieces of human bone burned, shattered. And at the end of that very chapter, the smell of roasting meat. They burned the dead after they slaughtered them. Like I said, it's disturbing. It's wrong. But stuff like this should be brought out into the sunlight. We need to know, we need to understand when this kind of thing happens. Yeah. Even former guerrilla leaders are like, yeah, they wanted, those who wanted to be with us had already come with us. They mostly like stayed pretty neutral. Unfortunately, sometimes war don't care if you're neutral. Especially one like that where everything was so vile. Death of, I think they said 23. They found the remains of 23 children. I shouldn't say bodies. They were mainly just bones at that point. Rufina is one of the last people, one of the few who survived. Sebastiano talks about he and his wife going into hiding when it happened. And you can't blame them. They were ordinary people. Unfortunately, Marcos Diaz, whether meaning to or not, kind of opened the door to the end. Telling them, no, stay, we will be safe. When clearly, that is not what happened. Yeah. And again, this should have been a war between two sides in Honduras. But the American government and military stuck its nose in. All for the sake of, we gotta fight communism. Enough. Even today, with the Russia Ukraine conflict and everything that's going on, enough. You do not need military action for everything, or even secretive action. We found out that the U.S. was already sending in special forces. We'd been there for a while into the Russia Ukraine conflict. I would love in my lifetime to see an extended period where America is no longer this warmonger. Can we have a period like that where we perform no special operations or not involved in a war? Can we have a Pax Americana? Like uh, the Pax Romana in history, which means it's literally just Roman peace. And so that's what I'm trying to say with the U.S. Let's have a Pax Americana, an American peace. We don't need to be constantly fighting. Oh, but that military industrial complex, gotta have that money. But yeah, I'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I appreciate y'all for watching. See you all in the next episode. Until then, later.